Well, happy afternoon, everybody. It's cold and rainy where I'm at, but I'm so happy that you chose to join us after lunch. Hopefully, you are here to keep taking those ideas we had with Dan Meyer earlier today and think about what that means for us. And we're going to look specifically at the CD kind of level for our students. So, um, we didn't change the title, we just massaged it a little bit. We have exploring variables in word problems, graphs, and equations. So hopefully you'll get the idea of what we're working on. So why are we here, right, Rebecca?
Yeah, so Rebecca Strom. I teach math in Mankato area. I teach on the campus with the community center. So I do the ESL ABE focusing on the GED math. And then also on the community college working with those below DevEd level and DevEd math classes. And then Amber.
I am Amber Delliger. I am a math instructor slash student success coach slash ABE advocate for Metro North Adult Education. I am currently working at Anoka Ramsey Community College and Anoka Technical College. I work very closely with DevEd math classes and the new Pathways to Success project with Min State. About COREX classes for students to be able to get their math skills built up while taking a college credit bearing course. I'm also the Adult Numeracy Network Region 3 representative, and you're going to be learning more. I know we talked about ANN earlier, but you'll hear more about it at the end of our session.
All right, so today, our goals for today, as you saw from the title, we're going to be looking at trying to focus on those level CD topics. We're going to use variables to describe relationships in application problems. We're going to try to create models to describe relationships and brainstorm ways to use these strategies in daily instruction. So some of the standards that inspired our session today, we won't be able to use the full breadth of these standards, but we're taking pieces from them. The 6EE6 about using variables to represent numbers and write expressions when solving a real world mathematical problem. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding a variable, excuse me, can represent an unknown number. And depending on the purpose at hand, any number in a set. We're also going to touch a little bit on using variables to represent two quantities in a real world relationship that can change that relationship to another. A little bit of writing equations to express a quantity. We're going to be talking a little bit about this idea of a dependent variable and independent variable and analyzing those relationships. So these are kind of what we brought that inspired us to think about. These are the standards we know a lot of us are teaching or struggling with teaching and how we can make those make more sense in our classes. So since we are going to be talking about these equations and relationships, we're going to be looking at graphs today. So I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and let's just talk about how to read a graph. So I have a few graphs on this slide, and we're just going to how do you read a graph? How do we make sense of a graph? And we're going to deal with the details of it later. I'm going to keep my eye on that chat box. So make sure if you have any questions, you don't hesitate to type them in. And so let's look at reading graphs. I know that it can be very overwhelming, but we're going to read this graph in a way that we kind of read a lot of things. We're going to be reading them from left to right. I know I do see a lot of confusion on reading from right to left, so I thought it would be worth talking about that a bit. So when we have our graph, we have two pieces of information. And so here we have our x-axis, that's the number line that is sitting on the bottom. And our y-axis, that's kind of the number line that looks like a thermometer, it's sitting up and down. And those are just places that we can record our information. So if I look at graph A, to make this make sense, I'm going to say that the x-axis, let's say, is the number of days that I've invested money. So how many days since I invested my money? And the y is going to be the number of dollars in that account, knowing that, remember, these numbers, these variables represent the number of something. So, right, not a great thing. So if I look at my graph A, on the first day, 0 days, and 1 day, 2 day, 3 days. So I started with this investment of money, and I'm always going to notice what's happening to my Y as my X is increasing. So I'm going to be reading this from left to right, noticing my relationship in my Y's. So let's use the chat box. And what do you notice is happening? So on this point, my Y is up here. Later on, my Y value is here, my connection between those two pieces of information. And this is happening here. Later, how could you describe what is happening in this graph? Y is decreasing. So as time passes, you're losing money. Exactly. So we're talking about this idea of as time increases, the number of days, the values are dropping. So that's that idea of a relationship between two things. Exactly. We try not to make it too real. Like I don't want to think about that retirement account too much right now. I'm just going to pretend it's growing. So so we're looking at this, and that what is that mathy word that talks about the relationship between the X and the Y in a situation like this? Does anyone know? We're noticing how things change. So as X is increasing, Y is changing in the same way every time, and it's decreasing. And right, that's slope. That's all slope is. It's that rate of change. How can we describe that relationship and the change? So what would you notice about graph B? And here, as my X is increasing, we have a constant rate of change, as Andy's pointing out. And how do we know it's constant? What makes it constant in that picture? It's a straight line, exactly. So it didn't change. The second one, it's as I read from left to right, my Y value that matches that relationship keeps going up. What do you notice about graph C? This one's a little bit different.
Somebody noticed that there's a flat part of that line.
That's right. So it's not necessarily straight. It's increasing, then it remains constant, then it increases again. That's very real life, right? So maybe there was, as X increases, as the days increase, I gained money, and then there's this kind of flat part. So on this day, I had $100. On the next day, I had $100. On the next day, I still had $100. And then it increased again. So what's happening in that space? What does the flat line show? What was my rate, or how did it change? It's constant. That's right. So we're talking about things increasing, and then it stayed constant for a while, and then that relationship showed an increase. And then D, what do we notice about graph D? Every day I check how much money I have, and what do you notice? It's constant. There is no change. And I just really wanted to just hit on this before Amber jumps in with this awesome activity she has. And so this idea that we can read our graph and notice as our X values are increasing, let's look for that connection of what's happening with Y at that same time. Any questions about reading these graphs? Absolutely. Those flat lines that people are noticing have a 0 rate of change or a 0 slope. There is no change.
So I'm going to transition us. I want you to kind of have your student hat on right now for the next few minutes for this activity. I don't want you to come into this super teachery. Rebecca primed your pump a little bit, but I also want you to think of as a student, how am I going to approach this activity? We are going to do something called a graphing story. I use graphing stories with my students often. We have been exploring linear relationships, linear equations, linear graphs in my class. In a few minutes, you'll actually get to see examples of my students' work. But we're going to start out with just looking at a graph story, because there are so many times in our real world where we get information that's given to us in a graph, and we have to understand what is happening, why things are happening, and what decisions can I make based on what we see. So what we're going to do, can we go back a second, please? What I want you to do is on your sheet of paper, hopefully you have paper with you. This is really, really important. So it can be a scribble, it's totally fine. I want you to take a second, and I want you to make a first quadrant graph. So this is quadrant 1, which means both my values are going to be positive numbers, and that's going to be really important. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I want your x-axis, that horizontal line, I want you to label that in time. Remember, time changes. We almost always put that as our x-axis. And I want you to have 15 marks because this is going to be a 15-second activity. And then I want you to do your y-axis from 0 to positive 10. And we're going to talk about what that axis is going to be in just a second. So I want you to just make a quick little sketch. It does not have to be perfect. If you do not have graph paper, it is totally fine. When you have your graph sketch, your axes ready, can you give me something in the chat, or can you give me a thumbs up reaction? Can you let me know that you're ready? Thanks, Mary. And Lorna, we got some great stuff. I see some thumbs up. Thank you so much for those of you who are using reactions. Alicia's ready. Awesome. All right, so what we're going to do is, please know that we are going to have fun, relax. We're going to have fun. So Rebecca, go ahead and go to the next slide. This is a graphing story, and I'm going to give you some directions before we watch it. This is my friend Adam. Adam is going to have a little bit of an adventure. If we look at this picture, we can see some things happening. Can somebody just in the chat really quick tell me, what do you think Adam's going to do? Just by looking at this screenshot right here on this slide, what is Adam going to do? He's going to go on the, he's going to go down a slide. Perfect. So if you've never been on a slide before, we want to just remember that we have to go up, because it's no fun to go on a slide that's flat. We have to go up and then go down a slide. Perfect. When you do this activity, I do want you to watch what's happening. So we're going to watch this 15 seconds a couple times. The first time, the first 15 seconds, I just want you to watch. Then we're going to watch it again. So first time, just watch. The second time, you're going to sketch. Then we're going to talk. Then we're going to think. And then we're going to revise. So this is a process of thinking that we're going to go through. I do not expect you to get it perfect your first go round. So pencils down. Rebecca's going to show you. Now this is a video, but there's no sound. The background noise is just like birds and traffic, which isn't important to this activity. So let's watch my friend Adam. First, I'm going to be quiet for 15 seconds. Just watch. Ooh, hold on, pause. Did you see how they labeled that axis real quick? They labeled my y-axis height of waist off the ground. That's curious. I'm wondering what that's going to mean. Okay, go ahead. Keep playing. All right, do you want to pause it right there for a second, Rebecca? All right, take a second and think to yourself, make sense of what you saw. Think about things you might want to watch more carefully in just in our next watch. Okay, so this next one is going to be in half speed. It'll give you some more time to catch details. While you're watching this, try to collect some data and make your sketch. All right, Rebecca, let's go. All right, we're going to pause it right here and give you a second to make your graph. Based on what data you collected, what you saw. Does anybody need to watch it again? All right, let's watch it one more time. Let's watch the half speed one more time. Now that you've sketched your graph, let's watch the half speed one more time. See if there's anything you would revise. Let's go. All right, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds here. Resketch your graph, whatever you need to do. Get your graph where you think you want it to be. What tells the story that my friend Adam had? All right, teacher hat on just for a second, a teacher aside. When I do this with students, they get really excited at the next part. We had a bunch of ruckus happen here. So you can decide as a teacher whether or not you want to debrief, have them talk to each other about their graphs before you give them the answer. Now, since we're kind of doing a timed PD experience, and because it's virtual and I can't easily see your pictures, I'm going to do it a little bit different than I might normally do. What I want to do before she gives us our answer, because we'll have an answer, there is an answer for this. What can you please enter in chat something that you thought was really important that you wanted to make sure you got on your graph? What were some important elements that should have been, what happened? What did we see? What are some elements that should have shown up on our graph? And I already saw some in the chat, so I know you have ideas. There's a constant. Now somebody's using math words. I don't know all these fancy math words. Why is the graph flat? What happened? The height of his waist changes a lot. So now Rebecca primed our pump and she gave us math words to use. If she hadn't primed your pump, what would you have said? He stopped for a while. Oh. What do you think was happening when he stopped? He stopped for a long time. Maybe he was scared. I have to go down the slide. Maybe I'm really nervous about getting tetanus on those metal slides, right? They don't get those anymore, right? So what I want you to do is I want you to let's watch the answer. And then we're going to talk through the graph for a second. Burns from the metal slide. That's right. We actually had a really interesting conversation with this particular graph with my students just yesterday. And we had a conversation around how playgrounds in elementary schools in England, or not necessarily England, in Europe in general, are designed for students to have more open play. Whereas some playgrounds in the United States are designed where there's really only like one or two ways to play, and how that has long-term effects on problem solving. And my students got really into that. All right, go ahead and let's play the answer here. Compare what this graph says to your graph. All right, let's pause it right there. Look at your graph and look at the answer. This is what his waist is. What are some things that surprised you? Ooh, that very end bit. That gets every single student that I did that had that, is that he slides down and then he kind of steps, like gets up like this, and you can kind of see that. The slight down at the top of the slide, because he goes kind of from the stairs to that piece as he walks. That very first bit. So if we walked through this, and I would make my students actually use their words to walk through the real world things that's happening. I want to make sure that they're understanding the change. When I asked you at the beginning, we got a lot of mathy words, which is great, but I want you to make sense of this first. So, Rebecca, why don't you go to the next slide? So these are my students' responses. I want you to take a second and look at my students' responses. And I asked them to be able to describe in words what they see happening. And in the top right corner in the orange box, we're really working hard at articulating in words what we see happening, what trends we see happening in a graph. So you can see that this student actually labeled the benchmarks in the video in their graph. So where in your graph can I see the person climbing the slide? Where in your graph can I see the person sitting? Where in your graph can I see the person going down the slide? And what's really amazing about this is that that top right graph, we were able to then talk about, slope. So we were able to talk about how he climbs the stairs in a constant rate, but that constant rate is a different constant rate than the constant rate he goes down the slide. And one of the things in the middle graph that you can see is that the student drew their first graph. We have lots of students who love to do things in pen, but then watched it again and realized there were elements he missed, because oftentimes we just talk in slope and it's rising from left to right. But what does that mean? This is a real world situation. I don't want the mathy words. I want you to tell me what's happening, and then I want to make sure my graph is matching that. And so one of the things I really like about this activity, and I want you to think about it in terms of what we learned this morning. What are some great things we see happening in these students' graphs? None of the 5 are correct. There are errors in all 5 graphs, but what are some great things that we see? What are some things that we can understand that my students know from looking at these graphs? There's labels on the axes. We worked really hard on that. Thank you for seeing that this represents something. What are some other things that my students know based on looking at these graphs? So we know that there's that the Y value is changing over time. What does that mean? Which is great. My top left student, you can notice that his is just kind of like a straight line down from left to right. What I can see about that is he understands that at one point the person was high, and at the other point the person was low, and I can see that on my graph that there was a point when it was higher, which is great. What do you think my feedback was, or what do you think we discussed with this bottom right-hand side, the light blue one? What do you think we saw there as an interesting opportunity? Oh, Lorna, that's a great thing. It kind of looks like a slide. So he was on the top of the slide, then he was on the bottom of the slide. I can see that that's an understanding. He knows that's something that's going on. And he knows that slope, as I go down, my height changes over time. So he understands that that rate of change is going down. What about this bottom right-hand corner with the one with the light blue box around it, if you can see the color? What do you think we talked about there? Because I noticed she's got a constant rate of change going up, and then it goes down a little bit and it stays. It's separate points, not a line. We had the most incredible discussion about how time doesn't stop, because I don't know what happened between 1 second and 2 seconds. Did we teleport? What would have had to have happened for us to have a graph that looked like this? And that created this really great discussion. And so one of the things that was really interesting about this when I did this with my students is that we were able to, I could ask questions. What happened at the moment of zero slope? And so then I was able to come in and bring in these words like Rebecca was using earlier, and my students could relate to it. But I could also say, when was the rate of change the fastest? And we had a great conversation about, why did he flop himself down on the slide so hard when he sat down, right? And then we talked about, what are all the things that could have made this zero slope happen? Or why do you think he climbed up so slow? Could he have moved up faster? And one of the most interesting things that my students came to on their own is, why did it only, so he did all this work to go down the slide for only a second and a half. And that's all this information that my students are able to gather from the graph. And we were able to kind of talk about those kinds of great things about this rate of change over time. So when we are looking at graphing stories, there are opportunities for me to see lots of different kinds of slope. So we have introduced positive slope as he's climbing up the slide. We've talked about almost undefined slope, but not quite, when he flops down onto the top of the slide. We talked about zero slope as he's sitting, waiting to get his bravery up to go down. And then we talk about negative slope as he goes down, which is a great summary for all the different parts of the slope that we've been talking about in class. So I really want to encourage you, Graphing Stories is a great resource. What is really cool about this website, this Graphing Stories website, which you'll have access to on the Padlet, is that it comes with everything you need. So it comes with these prompts, these questions you can think about. It comes with the little graph. So that little graph that we showed you on the beginning, that beginning pink slide, all of them are over time. Now, what changes over time will differ, but it only needs to take, the first couple times you do it, it takes a little bit, but then it becomes this challenge for them is who can get the most precise graph, which is what we want. Teresa, I love your point. My students got super angry because a lot of them love to think about feet and not waist. And then my other student got really, really grumpy at me because she's like, how am I supposed to know his waist is at 3 feet? And I was like, well, let's talk about it. How could we figure that out? How could we estimate it? But the more you do them, the more precise they want to get, which makes them much more critical thinkers when they're reading a graph or reading information, and how they communicate their reasoning becomes much more robust. So these are 15-second videos. They usually take me 5 minutes or less. I love them as a warm-up. So rather than giving them instruction first, I will do it at the beginning of a class. This, even though it's not a linear function, we had a really great time talking about why this isn't linear and what they knew. And so I was able to get a lot of information out of them over just measuring how this guy goes up and down a slide. So so if we go to the next slide, I think we're going to transition to another activity, but I want you to take a second real quick and just think about, what are some benefits of using an activity like a graphing story as a warm-up or as an activity in class? Thinking back to what we talked about this morning in terms of, you know, making math powerful and having math be something powerful, what would be a benefit? Real life doesn't always start at 0, 0, does it? It gets them thinking and is interested. Now, this isn't like a real life problem. Like, nobody's ever going to graph their life on a slide, except for in my class, of course. But I have had students from lots of different countries, and almost all of them have at least seen a slide. math talk is really important in this. We don't always have to have super serious conversations. Our math doesn't always have to be about a serious topic. So Teresa, you'll see the link for graph stories in the Padlet that you've gotten on your handout, and it will also hand out that link again at the end of the session. But there are a number of graphing stories available in lots of different contexts. This just happens to be the one I did yesterday with my students, so I thought I would do it with you today. All right, so Rebecca, we've talked about fun things we can do with some graphs, but we kind of have to be more mathy again. So let's look at variables. Ugh, that sounds disgusting.
I do like to add what I loved about this activity that Amber was able to do, and it was the first time I'd seen it, was hearing about it from Amber, was it takes all of the memory work and things that you've been memorizing and it makes it like cement to make sense. And so being able to relate to that information is really important. Yes, and that brings us to, this is a pictorial way to represent stuff. Remember, in math, we represent information. We can do it numerically, we can do it writing equations, we can do it through a graph, we can do it through a picture. And sometimes we have to be able to record that data in different ways. So we have to figure out a way to record the information we know, as well as the information we don't know. So this is just one.
Rebecca, you don't want to say the height of his waist and over feet per second, the height of his weight in feet per second over and over again. You want a more efficient way to talk about it?
Perhaps. And then, yes, being able to record all those fractional pieces in between, right? The parts that we can't always record. Like the one student who recorded the dots were probably the markers that she was paying attention to, but there's always that information in between as well. So let's just do a quick overview and kind of talk about how do we record information and what are variables. And once again, I always love to explore things and make it make sense. And so we wanted to start with a real life situation. I just got a job where I earn an hourly wage of $18 an hour. I want to plan a budget, so I want to understand how much I will make. So we can record information. And what is one way you might sit down, or a person might sit down to figure out how many hours I would make work to get this much money, or how much money I would get if I do this much hours. We know if there's relationships back and forth. What is one way you might do things to figure out some budget plans, given this information? Any thoughts? Have you ever taken your budget or your paycheck and thought, well, I need to work so many weeks or so many hours, how much I can expect to make in a week? Exactly. You might make a table, and then you can make very specific information. Consider how many hours you would make exactly. So we want to estimate as a great way to think about these numbers. So let's do that idea. Let's make a table and let's see. And we want to think about things from that if-then kind of relationship. Right? You might record, do I even work the same number of hours each week? So if I want to make this budget, I need to kind of start with some basic information. So if I work this many hours, then I would earn this many dollars. And I need to think about how those pieces are related. So it's always a great idea to start with what we know. So I know that if I don't work, I'm not going to make any money, right? 0 hours makes $0. If I work 1 hour, I'm going to make the $18. And we want to look at that idea of how many hours we work to get those final numbers. We can do this all day long. Unfortunately, making a table to get to the end of the week or the end of the month might be quite an excessive table. So what are some things you might notice looking at this table? Are there any patterns you might see? If I want to know how much I work every week changes or every month changes, this could be quite an excessive table. So how can I avoid that? What relationships or what patterns might you notice? Check in the chat box. What do you guys think? I see somebody, Lynn's mentioning the number of hours times 18. Is that always going to hold true in this situation? And of course, we're talking pre-tax. I see the word taxes popping up, but pre-taxes, any withholdings, will that hold true?
Ooh, I love Vicky's idea that if I work more hours, I should earn more dollars. Absolutely.
There is that great increase.
If I wanted to figure out how, if I worked 100 hours, how much money would I make? Those kind of patterns are going to be important for me to notice.
And that pattern is going to be important in that it'll save me the trouble of writing a table with 100 rows. So I might notice what's changing and what stays the same. So in my chart, what changes and what stays the same? I'm checking the chat box. I see some great notes. I see an equation. I'm going to hold off on the equation for a second. What do you notice that changes? The hours change. Every day I might work a different number of hours. What do you notice that stays the same?
Carol's seeing that the rate is staying the same. So $18 per hour is staying the same.
The hourly wage stays the same. And I think that that's a really great connection between noticing a pattern of what stays the same and what is changing. And when we look at these patterns about staying the same and changing, we start to be able to use that vocabulary of what stays the same is our constant, and what changes or varies is our what? What's the magic math word I'm looking for? That has to do with something changing or varying. That variable. And I think the word variable is an awesome word, and it's not taught from the perspective very much of just vocabulary definition. If something is a variable, it's because it changes. And so in this, I can rely on the fact that I get paid $18 for every hour I work, but the number of hours may change. Now in that standard we were looking at connecting relationships between two pieces of information. We were looking at this idea of, okay, I know what stays the same and I know what changes, and I don't want to write this table for 100 rows. So I can do this. And what happens when I don't know something?
I cry. No. Oh, so Carol's saying I could use a variable, and Mary's agreeing. I could use a variable because I know that's the thing that might change. Okay.
And I like the way Andy mentioned it's able to vary, because it could possibly stay the same, but it has the ability to vary. And because of that ability, I can't guarantee what it is. So I'm always going to be open for that change. So if I don't know what it is, but I do know I'm going to multiply by 18, I'm just going to write 18 times whatever that number is. And that variable can look like anything I want it to be. We tend to use letters because it's easier and we're used to it. It could be a question mark, could be a box, could be a symbol. There's a lot of ways to show what the unknown is. Now, as we're looking at this relationship, we've kind of gotten the idea of the relationship. We know that what is constant is that 18 hours, dollars, excuse me. What changes is the number of hours I might work. What do you else know is that we always talk about things, and in an idea of, in that standard, it mentioned the idea of dependent and independent variables. I know that that can be a challenge to separate, but looking at this equation, what do you think is going to depend on which one, as what information depends on what? Yeah, the pictures are very helpful for just cementing what we're talking about instead of letters, if you like. And I see Mary is mentioning that pay depends on the number of hours. So in that standard, as we're looking through and we're digging in deeply, we can connect this to this idea of an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is the number of hours. It's random. It can be anything else. It stands on its own. But in this relationship, the number of dollars are in our output. What comes out of it is going to be dependent on how many hours. So my paycheck depends on the hours I work. So as we're looking through, we're going to play with this idea a little bit more about building and connecting and seeing some relationships between numbers in a variety of ways. But the idea of a variable being that unknown piece of information represented in any number of ways. And it kind of is that mystery piece we were talking about with Dan, like the part that sucks you in. Ooh, I'm curious. Let me see what I can do to find out this mystery piece of information. Any questions on any of the pieces so far? Any reflection on either the graphing story, or is it just kind of looking for and building relationships, or how to represent those relationships? Yeah, the alternate symbols are, I'd love for the freedom of the students. Students have the freedom to represent it in any way they want to.
And if we took a second and thought about if we were going to try to build an equation, now obviously my students might build a statement around part of the graphing story we did, we wouldn't pick the variables X and Y for that situation, because that doesn't help us understand. It doesn't help us to tell that story. So we might have T for time instead of X. We might have H for height instead of Y. And that becomes really important, because the thing our students don't realize is that the X and Y can mean something, but when we're only doing it in X and Y, they have a hard time bringing these things into context, making this math meaningful. And so if I'm using H and T, we get to have a really cool conversation, because I can actually see in my equation what's happening. So in Rebecca's situation, she probably wouldn't pick X and Y for hers. What would be variables that would make sense to pick for Rebecca's situation?
Any suggestions? So H
For
and I
hours?
could have 18 times H. I'm reading through the chat box. It could be equal to D for the number of dollars earned.
I like that somebody's using the dollar sign, because I can use a dollar sign, right? Those are really great ideas. And what our students don't know is that what really becomes helpful is if we can label our graph or create a way of saying let. This is a great opportunity for let statements. Our students don't realize that they get power and control in mathematics. So I really push my students really hard to create a let statement. So for them to just take a minute and say, I'm going to tell you, when you're doing this math, this is what I want you to think. And for my students to write, let H equals height and D equals dollars. And then they get to pull that all the way through, and they get to decide. They have that power, they have that control. That's a really meaningful opportunity for them, which then helps and pays out a lot later when we're talking about systems of equations, like what happens when we have two lines and we have to make decisions. And so what's really cool is that when we can empower our students as mathematicians, we can actually get them to have more buy-in, because you have to pick, but you have to be consistent. I have to be able to follow the rule that you make. And so my students really like to start with X and Y. It's really, really, really hard to break them of let X and let Y. But as soon as we start having word problems, which is where our students fall apart, if I push them, if I told you X and Y were broken and you had to pick some other letter of the alphabet, what one would you pick and why? They contextualize that problem almost immediately in a meaningful way. If I ask them, well, why didn't you pick Q for hours? They would literally look at me and have a mystified look on my face, like, why would I pick Q? And I'm like, oh, well, why did you pick H then? Well, because it tells me about hours. Oh, is that important? Is that, as a mathematician, that's going to help me make sure my problem works out? And oftentimes, because X and Y are so arbitrary for most of our contexts, that is the thing that students don't realize, that this math is the aspirin to help us get through some of the headache of that word problem, and how we can really use this tool to our advantage. And so using let statements in context like this is a tool we use in our toolkit.
I just want to, there's a comment in there about be careful about units. And then I have to say, when I was took algebra in 8th grade, we were required to write let statements for every variable we used for a story problem. And it had to start out, let X be the number of. And so that really helped with the number of feet in the height, the number of people in the building. And I think it made a big impact on me because I always saw X's, all variables, as the number of things. And that was really, really helpful. And then also at the end of a story problem, if you want to know what you're talking about, you already wrote it in that first sentence. Because we always get to that statement where we got X is 7, and you ask them, what were you finding? And they say, I don't know. But if they had written down X is the number of books in the box, X is the number of feet per the height, X is the number of ounces in the cup, it always helps to have that decision made first so they even know what they're looking for. Because we do jump in a lot and just say, I don't know, and those hunt and peck in a story problem, you read through, you circle the numbers, and you try to figure out what to do with them instead of starting with what the information you know.
It also helps them slow down, because I think this morning we had a great person in chat say, especially with that big long expression that Dan gave us, that when we simplified it got us down to 0 and the math was super great. We have this really intense urge to just approach a problem and start mathing. There's this misconception that speed equals quality of mathematician. And so when we pause and ask our students, what do variables mean in this contextualized problem, it encourages them to slow down. And when we are able to take a breath and get some success under our belt by making sense of it, that's going to reduce our math anxiety. And in problems that are contextualized, that is one of the first things that happens with students, is their math anxiety gets kicked up. So I could talk about that all day. One of the things we wanted to do is we wanted the beginning of this experience for you to kind of be a little bit of student, a little bit of teacher, so that you could get some experience on how do we really introduce some of these ideas, how do we play with them, but then also some teacher hat things to think about as you're incorporating it. In the next half of our session, we are going to be giving you a problem that you're going to have to solve. And it's going to be a real world problem. And we're going to really encourage you to approach it as a student. And we want that student hat on, but then we're going to close our opportunity to be with you today with a good teacher hat on. So we're going to try to go back and forth between these formats. I love this idea of, well, what can we notice? And by pausing and looking, what can we notice? That's going to become really, really important. Lorna is not a plant in our session, but I think she's going to really enjoy what happens next. But before we get to that point, though, Rebecca, I think we should take a break. Is it break time?
Well, it's a little early. Our break is getting a little on the short of the half mark, but when we come back, we're really going to give you, so this was a challenge for Amber and I. We've both presented for Atlas before, and it's easy to rush things, and we want to give you a lot of time to explore. So we're going to come back from break. We're going to jump into this task. And this is a Dan Meyer task inspired by, he's done a lot of these. This task specifically isn't Dan Meyer's, but he has inspired this, which really gets those conversations going. We're going to dig in, we're going to explore, and we're going to have opportunities to talk. So we're going to come back and be in breakout rooms when you get back. Be prepared with your paper and your pencil. Be prepared, like Amber said, to have both the teacher and student experience, but student experience is first. We're going to dig in, we're going to talk, we're going to learn how we do this. So any questions before you go off to break? We're going to go ahead and give you a quick 15-minute break, so that when we come back, we've got a full hour till the end of really digging in.
Please come back after break. So stretch, move around, move your body, get a snack. Cold water is really good. Introducing some cold beverage will help your brain fire again. So please make sure you take advantage of those opportunities, because we're going to work you really hard in the next chunk of the session. So we will see you in 15 minutes. If you do have a question, go ahead and drop it into chat. Otherwise, we will see you back here in 15 minutes. We're going to get, I hope you had a good break. I found myself some chips and some drinks, so it'll be great. I am going to give everybody a second just to kind of get themselves back situated here. ready to go. We got the last hour of our session together. We are going to hopefully get you a lot of good stuff to walk away with from today.
Should we, sorry, quick do that thing that Lindsay did. If you're back, just chat in the chat box so we know that we've got everyone and we can move forward. So go ahead and chat in the chat box.
Lorna,
I don't want you to miss anything that Amber's going to say.
Carol's here, Teresa's here, Rob's here. Hi, Donna. Hi, Beth. Look at all these people.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So excited you're here.
And the people watching the recording didn't even have a break. So they're like, break? What?
And for those of you watching the recording, all the information is going to be in all the Padlets, so you won't miss out on any of these websites or resources.
Excellent. It looks like we've got a good chunk of humans back here ready to do some math. So we are going to talk about one of our favorite activities that is a kind of a more well-known Dan Meyer approach to math. And these are called 3-act tasks. Now, I like that they're called tasks and not problems and not challenges. A task is something that we can accomplish. And I find that like calling things that I do with my students tasks is kind of a mind shift, and we can kind of have this mindset change that this is something that we can do. It's something that we can accomplish, and we can have something to show for our work as we get things moving. So Rebecca put a great prompt in the chat here. We're wondering, has anybody done a 3-act task with their students before? Ooh, not yet. I hope you're going to after this.
Similar, a lot of no's. So that's good experience.
So a 3-act task is something that happens in 3 acts. And so one of the things that we're going to show you today is we're going to show you one type of 3-act task. And now remember this morning, if you went to Dan's session this morning and he answered the question of, how do I do these? These are kind of making me anxious and nervous. And he said, don't make them, use the ones that are already there. Rebecca and I did not take that advice. So Rebecca and I tried to make one. You're going to get to play with one that we kind of took and kind of modified for our experiences. But there is an entire database, and that link will be sent to you on that Padlet that you'll have from today's event. So there is multiple databases, but a couple of really good databases of 3-act tasks assigned to different standards. So remember that when you're working with the CCRS and you're trying to find standards that work for what you're working on, those standards do correlate with the Common Core standards. So you can Google 6.ee.6 and you can find 3-act tasks that align with that standard, which is really great. So we can use resources that our K-12 colleagues have already put together. So 3-act tasks are things that we're going to do in 3 specific chunks. So this isn't a send them on their way and then come back together kind of activity. It is a carefully orchestrated activity where we get a piece of real world information, whether it's in a video or a picture or some realia of some kind, and students are asked to just act 1 is just to look. Remember, we talked about earlier in the session that idea of pausing and thinking and activating that prior knowledge. Because remember, we heard this morning again that everybody knows at least something about everything. So they can look at, what do they know? What do they wonder? What are some of the questions that they have just looking at some information? Then we provide a question, or students come up with a question depending on what your goal is for that lesson. We will provide you a question today just for the sake of time, but you are absolutely able to do this where students generate the questions that they have based on their notice and wonders. Then once you have a question, you need to figure out what information do you need about that situation to answer your question. And so what'll happen is that you'll get some information that hopefully will help you answer the question. And then in our third act, we get an answer of some sort, and then we reflect. So did we get an answer that kind of makes sense, or was our approach on point? Was there something we forgot about? Like with Rebecca's question earlier, and we were looking at that, we didn't take into account taxes. If we took into account taxes, how would that have changed our overall situation? And then we have this reflection, and how can we take what we learned in this experience and bring it forward to a similar experience? So these 3 acts are done in a way where we are not as helpful. As math teachers, we are much too helpful to our students. And so the idea with this is that a student is feeling empowered. The student is feeling like there's mystery and intrigue and something that they are connected to. A lot of the work around equity in mathematics is about creating and finding moments of real curiosity for our students in a context that matters to them. So seeing in these kind of situations what information is interesting, what is piquing their interest, is a really important tool. So let's go to the next slide real quick.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a quick piece. This whole activity falls under what Dan was saying about if math is the aspirin, we want to create the headache. And from what I understand, the way he chose to break these down is like based on a really awesome movie. If you're watching something, a good movie, in the beginning, you start to notice things and you start to wonder, and then you're gathering up information, and then you're trying to solve this mystery in the end. So it's this way of breaking things down into ways that suck you in so you are curious. And so it's a very real life experience.
So why would we use a 3-act task? Why would we want to create this kind of opportunity for our students? So this is a context for learning. There is no worksheet. There is not a pathway that is a nice, neat, created way that a student will have an answer. This says that, okay, in real life, you're going to have to do some critical thinking. What are the things that we're going to have to do to be able to do that? So this creates these transferable skills that go far beyond the math classroom. But anytime you come up against a situation where you have to figure out an answer or create your own pathway, these are the skills we're practicing. These 3-act tasks are often a video or a picture. It really reduces a lot of the literacy demand. So that creates an opportunity for these multiple entry points, these low floor, high ceiling tasks where students have fewer barriers to being able to come in and do something with the task. So now if you're working with me where you have a very wide range multi-level classroom, everybody can notice something that could potentially be helpful, or everybody can wonder something that could help drive the conversation regardless of literacy level. It also is really a great way to honor our students' prior knowledge and prior experiences. The task you're going to be doing today is an experience that may not be completely universal, but ties really into something that like everybody has some sort of experience with. These tasks are also really important for the idea of estimation and reasonableness. Does my answer make sense? Well, in a real world context, it's really important to have these skills and to pause and think about these. This is also a great way for us to practice that mathematical practice 4, that modeling. This is real modeling, not the modeling that we like to pretend like we're doing when we make an equation, but this is real world situations, creating a real mathematical model, whether it's a graph or an equation or something else that helps us explore this. This is that mathematical practice 4, which is key for our students to be able to work on. And like I said, this is a lot of opportunity for mathematical practices. So in this is not a solo person task. We're going to be creating rationale about why we think something is going to work or what we notice. We're going to be defending that reasoning with other people. We're going to have to create this good argument. We're going to have to try to find patterns and see how can that help us then maybe identify a variable or identify is there an equation, or is there something that's constant in this situation? And then when we're doing that, we're going to have opportunities where what we thought was going to work isn't going to work, especially as we get new information. And that's one of the things that we learned so much about this morning. As we get new information, our approaches change and evolve. And so we are going to be using activities like this to really dial in on those mathematical practice experiences. So 3-act tasks are they're an experience you're going to have in 3 different acts. So think about like a play, right? So what's going to happen is that you are going to experience a 3-act task, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So what we're going to do is we are going to split us off into breakout rooms. In your breakout rooms, there will be a facilitator. The facilitator is not the sage on the stage. So if I'm facilitating your room, I'm not doing the work. We are helping, but it's going to be really driven by us as a team. Same thing if you're in Rebecca's room, same thing if you're in Andy's room. So please make sure that you are in a position where you have ready access to your chat, or you can unmute, but it's going to only work if we're all participating. So when we're doing the task, I want your student hat on, I want your participant hat on. And then at the end of the activity, we're going to reflect as a teacher. So try to stay as engaged as possible as a participant and as a student. We are going to be using a Jamboard. If you do not have if you're using a mobile device and do not have the Jamboard app on your phone, it's okay. We'll share our screen. It'll work out fine. But one of the things that I want you to know is that we really want you to get engaged and try this, and think about how might you help your students stay engaged in these kind of activities as well. Rebecca, is there anything I'm forgetting?
No, your facilitator will have the links to your Jamboard, so you don't need anything yet. And because we want to be really careful that there's no sneak peeks of what's happening, there actually will be 3 separate Jamboards, one for each act, so that you're not able to find out more information that will change your decision-making process. So in your groups, we'll start with Act 1 Jamboard. Then when the facilitator in your group is done, the facilitator will give you the 2nd Jamboard, and then the 3rd. Like I said, this is an experience first, and then we will reflect as whole group together as instructors.
Okay, our question.
Andy, what was your question?
Okay, our question, when we went through our Act 3 and we had the actual equations, they showed $5.99 for the GE washer plus $15 times
typo.
X. And then the other one had $399. So we're assuming that was a typo. But
Yeah, that would be a typo looking at it. Sorry about that. I hope I missed that as well. Sorry. Yes, that would be a typo. The pink row should have all been $5.99.
Right, but the difference in cost.
Could we talk about that with our students about how does that change it? And is that something that we need to consider? It was not a mistake. It was.
I was just trying to think of how do you put a positive spin on. It was a full error on my part.
But it's human, right? We make typing errors, and how is it possible that when we make an error in typing, could that really impact our decision making, and what might be the outcome of that later? My group had some really interesting noodles, and I would love to hear if there is anything that we can share as a large group. What are the benefits of doing a task like this with your students? So please use the chat. We'd love to hear from you. What are some benefits of using a 3-act task or a task similar to this in your setting? What would some benefits be?
I would also say if you wanted to unmute yourself, we could also handle that with this group as well.
Yeah, nice, Justine.
Yeah, students are talking and asking questions, not just the instructor.
I see some people talking about who gets to be the keeper of the knowledge, which is great. They can come up with the questions, and they can have some really great things that they can share with us. The idea that they can come up with the question being answered is super huge.
We also had a really healthy discussion within our group on the concept of the cost relationship, but also the potential longevity relationship. There was a lot of discussion about how many stars in the reviews the different washers had, and would there be able to be parts found if the washer actually broke within those 10 years, and might that have an effect on it?
Those are great points. Yeah, and those are the real life pieces we have to consider. Someone in our group mentioned they don't list the size of the machines if you want to make sure it fits. Nowadays, there are quite a variety of sizes. I'm just going to read through some of the chats. These tasks can be community building is one of the comments I'm reading. The students being able to come up with the questions. Today, we provided the questions for this experience, but in you really could allow different students to work on their own question, especially if you had a diverse classroom of diverse levels and abilities.
And this could be done with multiple groups of students doing it. And then you could compare where they talk about, oh, well, we took it in this direction and we took it in this direction, which provides a really robust opportunity for learning from each other. My group had a really great comment that is really important, I think, in 2022 is with supply chain issues. If I'm paying for a cheaper machine, that's great. But if I can't get it for 6 months, am I really making any savings if I have to go to the laundromat while I'm waiting?
And then this, that's a great point. And this question we tacked on if you're going to own it for 10 years, but in real life, when you go to the store, you kind of have to decide, I might only be at this resident for 5 years, and that's going to change all the information in a very different way. So being able to make that really personal, and really relevant is important. And I saw that comment in here, realistic and engaging. And there was something in here also about really relevant information. Relevant and applicable is what I'm reading from Carol. I just want to kind of gather some of these thoughts, and especially for the people, if they're watching a recording, just to hear what some of the people are saying too.
There's a great comment in here from Jeremy that I think is really important as we are working with adults who have to make hard decisions a lot of the time. Are those things that we consider for a washing machine, the same kind of things we consider at maybe a blender level, and how might those decisions change? We talked about in my group, one of my favorite comments that came up was, but the buttons look cuter on the other one. And so it reminds me of how often when I'm at the store and I'm like, okay, is this shirt $10 cute? Or is it, $20 cute? And I have to make a decision. So I love that, and how we can then take this and knowing what information we needed. And I loved that in my group, we were screaming, I don't know what the price is. I don't know what the price is. I don't know what the price is. But as we dug deeper, we realized there was more we needed to know than just what the price of the machine was.
Well, in
And this is, go ahead,
our
Andy.
thing, we went through and talked about the washing that I have to do in my home is significantly different than the washing like my sister has to do in her home, because her husband is an auto mechanic. So, they have to deal with the grease and all that stuff that when I'm working as a teacher, I don't have to do. And if you've got a larger family, you've got a 5, 6, 7 person family, will having the smaller washer mean you have to do more loads because you're still doing the same amount of laundry, but the smaller one wouldn't hold the volume of laundry you would need to get done. You have to do 8 loads instead of 7.
Right. And while this is a grand scale, like you said, you do the same thing on buying a blender, but we also have to think this way when you're at the grocery store, and this is so much for a 12 pack and this is so much for a 3 pack, and one tells you ounces and one tells you per unit, or you have 2 coupons and it's 20% off or $5 off, and you notice and wonder, I wonder which one will be the better deal for me today. I wonder which is a better impact on my budget today. And so it's that idea of all of these things being a bigger picture. You start thinking, you start to be curious, you want to do the math because now you want to know the answer instead of just, I'll just buy it, I don't care, isn't realistic for everyone.
Adam's got that great question that we'd love to pose to our students. is a $17 an hour job that's an hour away a really good deal? If I could get a $15 an hour job, but it's only 5 minutes away, maybe I could walk. Those are the kinds of decisions that our students need to make. The really great thing is that we can do modeling where we're making equations, where we're doing math that maybe doesn't feel super overwhelming. Maybe in this context, it feels like, I don't know how I would ever make that decision. But then when we're able to realize there's maybe some simpler ways to look at some of the math to at least make an educated decision, that's really important. So one of the things we want to do as we're ending our time together today, we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to look at this first question here. What is something that we explored with you this afternoon that connects to a point that Dan made this morning in his sessions? So what is something you learned or something you explored, something you thought about in this afternoon session that connects to something Dan talked about this morning? And feel free, you can unmute if you want to, it's okay.
I'll read a few responses. Lindsay's saying using student responses to facilitate learning. Andy is saying none of the questions were bad. We were wondering about a lot of things. So that idea of not being wrong, the mistakes aren't necessarily a negative experience. Communication, no misconceptions, only conceptions. Using the 5 C's to examine a math-informed scenario.
Ooh, I love that math-informed scenario. That's what we did. That's great.
These acts promote thinking and problem solving. There's really nowhere to make a mistake. And I'm just gonna, math is the aspirin to solve these situations, which washer, absolutely. And it immediately goes to the students saying, I only want to do math that's on the GED, I'll never use it in real life. These are, convincing them there is real life application for what we're doing. We're trying to empower and strengthen their understanding so that they are sufficiently understanding all the information and independent on not trusting someone, tell me what's a better deal, I don't know, which is fine for small things, but sometimes those expenses, it's hard to trust the person across the counter telling you what to buy, right? There are many answers and they vary according to our experiences.
There's some great stuff happening in the chat. I love this idea of brainstorming and having this insight and doing these things as a group. But what the amazing thing is that investing the time into doing some of these activities and then giving them a worksheet where they're working on maybe some linear equations where they can see this stuff on a worksheet, it actually allows a lot of this thinking to happen because they now have a connection to it. They have some buy-in to it. So you can say, yeah, this is a real world situation where you're doing linear modeling. Now let's do some linear modeling. And then maybe can we think of a real life situation that we could make from that equation? You can go both directions, which is really important.
I love one more comment was whatever someone is sharing is making sense to them right now. So I love just that last idea that was taken from Dan's session, keeping that everyone's contributing something meaningful. I love that ending. I just wanted to add one more comment.
So beautiful. And I think that came out a lot when we were talking about what's important as we're looking at washers. And what information my participants wanted to be able to make that decision is really important. It tells us a lot about the lens that they're using and their past experiences that they're bringing to problem solving right now. So these are all really great ideas. Rebecca and I wanted to make sure you had time to really explore some ways of doing activities that Dan Meyer really likes to do and his kind of belief system. But these are not necessarily easy. They take a lot of risk taking for us as instructors to do. Being able to go into a task where there isn't one right way to do one right way to handle it, or all of these things, is sometimes overwhelming for I mean, Rebecca and I have been doing this for like 400 years, and we still we're kind of nervous. But one of the things that we want is we want to continue these conversations outside of the context of this session. We are looking at making newsletter articles and PD experiences. I know for 400, we do look great. But one of the things we want to know from you as we are planning the rest of our year as PD providers for you, what additional resources do you feel like you need to be able to try these? So if you're watching the recording and you have a great idea, you can send that along to Atlas staff, or you can contact me and Rebecca. But for those of you that are in the session with us today, what kind of resources or support do you feel like you need right now to implement some of the things that Dan talked about this morning, or some of the things that we talked about this afternoon?
What do you feel like would be helpful, or what do you feel like you still need? It's like people are thinking while they're writing. While they are doing that, I'm just going to double check any other chats. And I'm going to pull up a couple other resources. So while you're thinking about things and you're thinking forward, I just wanted to mention, I don't have all the tabs open right now, but this is one. Dan Meyer has more of the upper level math. There's a lot of ones that are awesome, and they're in the Padlet, and that Padlet link will be dropped pretty soon, right at the end of the session. So you have access to these resources. But just so you can see, when you Google them, you can see the standard code. You can type in the code. They have the recordings. They have all 3 acts built in. So like Dan said, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Know that these resources are out there, but sometimes it's overwhelming digging through it. So we as a team can work together and help find some really adult appropriate ones, and kind of like think about that moving forward.
Finding time to implement these is absolutely real. I think one of the things I can encourage is just to try them. I will let you know, as somebody who's tried a lot of these lessons, sometimes they do not go well. If you have a group that's really quiet, or if you have a group that maybe you haven't kind of built that trust or rapport with, where they're willing to take those risks, sometimes the conversation doesn't really happen that well, and that's okay. Do not take that as a reason to not keep trying. They will really enjoy it, especially as you develop the expectation that your classroom is not going to be a sit and get environment, and that they're going to do that work. But sometimes they crash and burn, and that is just parts of life. But then you'll have amazing opportunities like what I had with my students yesterday doing the graphing story, where it was incredibly rich. Yes, my students, I see something in the chat about students being willing to, like, hey, we're going to try something new. Students are usually pretty chill about it. All right, so let's go to the next slide and let's talk about where can I get some resources, because you're not alone. You shouldn't have to do all this work on your own. So we have some examples of some places you can find resources. So obviously, you know about Atlas because you're here, but I want to remind you that Atlas has an amazing numeracy resource library. It is beautifully organized. There's a ton of great stuff on there that has been vetted. So people on the A team have looked at these resources. So that's a great place to start. I think oftentimes we forget that it's there. So remember, Atlas Numeracy Resource Library is beautiful. We're going to talk more about the Adult Numeracy Network, but there is an entire resource page, and a lot of those resources are free and available even if you're not an Adult Numeracy Network member. All the resources posted on the Adult Numeracy Network, their resource page, all align to the Adult Numeracy resource beliefs about education and learning, so you know that they're quality resources. You can also Google. I know that Dan actually Googled in the middle of his session, which I want to kind of say, don't forget that Googling is a thing. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out what to Google. So we have some suggested keyword searches. If you Google 3-act tasks, you can find videos of people implementing it. You can find examples. You can find how to make your own. You can find sheets for students to use. Rich math tasks, that seems to be one of the key words for some Dan Meyer-ified kind of lesson approaches. U Cubed has some great tasks that you can use as well. And then the always helpful low floor, high ceiling math tasks. Those are just some things you can Google to get ideas from. Know that Google's a resource and it's fine. And then obviously our new best friend, Dan Meyer here, he has a great resource of 3-act tasks, and he also has a blog that he does pretty regularly. And then, so the link to that is on this slide as well. I will say one of the things that's super fascinating is that Dan Meyer is really active on Twitter. More than once, I have tweeted out into the Twitterverse that I was trying to do an activity. I needed something to do this specific thing I wanted to do with my students. And Dan specifically replied to me, or another person at Desmos replied to me. So there is a community out there on Twitter that Dan happens to be a part of that is really great about sharing their stuff. So know that those are resources that are out there.
I'm just going to talk really briefly about the Adult Numeracy Network. It is an amazing organization. It's national. Actually, it's international now because we have some connections, and I'm forgetting the country off the top of my head, but we are branching out. It is an amazing network of colleagues who are teaching adult education math all over. We share struggles, we share success stories, we share resources. The website looks something like this. I just want to show you a few things. If you click on practice, they have, a lot of, I think there was a session that Amber did at Summer Institute about classroom activities. And we also have Math Practitioner, which is their newsletter. There's Practitioner Research, which is, we're trying to grow the field of adult education practitioner research. Instead of finding studies or activities that work for K-12, people are struggling and proposing ideas and doing it in the adult education world and writing papers. Adult Numeracy Network sponsors this. There is a stipend to support researchers in the field, and those researchers are simply us, adult educators. So if you're interested in thinking of some research you would like to do about how your students are learning, know that there is support and help to continue that field. We have, they have every year at COABE conference, they have a numeracy pre-conference full day session that is also amazing. So if you have questions about ANN, I am the state rep, Amber is the regional rep. So don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can direct you to who you need, find some more resources perhaps, or just brainstorm together.
And underneath that practice tab, you'll also see that's where the resources are. Under math and numeracy resources. That's
right. Oops, sorry, I clicked on it. And instructional routines, that's the phrase I was trying to do. Virtual manipulatives are in here. Desmos is in here. Some more resources are awesome. I'm just looking at the clock, so I'm trying to stay on task. This is the information about the Adult Numeracy Network. Like they said, it's $20 a year. And it's for 1 year. I think 2 years is, I don't remember, 35 or something, but 3 years is only 40. So there is that break in there as well. And then looking forward about announcements, we have some math support, and today is Math Institute, and you experienced it and it's awesome. And there will be, if you have follow-up questions, we're trying to get things together at regional. So maybe if you have questions like Amber asked earlier, what supports you think you would need moving forward, reach out to us. As we look forward to more professional development for numeracy, we want to hear what people need. Then we've got some CCRS webinars coming up in October, as Astrid, I believe, announced, the math content webinars, and then MCTM is in Duluth this year again in April. Have any of you attended MCTM in the past? While you're thinking of that, just to let you know, there is financial support when Atlas has scholarships. So it is an amazing conference. It is both K-12 and ABE. And when I said both, I meant to say all three, because it also has some AMATIC, which is the Teachers of Two-Year College, which means we have K through college thinking activities and audience members there. So those are the target audiences. So we fit right in there. And there's been a lot of work to get ABE fully represented there. So they are considering us as they build their sessions, and it's been an amazing experience.
So Andy, if you want to drop the link to our Padlet, that would be fantastic. One more thing, Peter Lilladal is going to be the keynote at the MCTM conference, which is a really great opportunity for us to get some access to some more amazing internationally known mathematicians. So we have about 2 minutes left. We are really want to encourage you to make sure you fill out your evaluation to get your CEUs, but also if you try some of these, please email us, let us know how it goes. If you try one of these and you learn something important, please consider writing a newsletter article about something that you tried and what you learned to maybe share something in the field. We are available for questions. If you have questions, we can stick around right now. If they're the kinds of questions that you need to have ruminate for a little bit and email us later, we are available through email. Ooh, Marisa wants to remind you, if you try something and write a newsletter article about it, you can earn $50. Hey, A+ on that. All right, friends. Well, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in chat. We are here to answer those. We really appreciate you sticking with us until 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you so much. You guys have been awesome. I've learned a lot from the conversations. I always appreciate hearing what you guys are thinking and sharing. And I learn a lot just from hearing what you guys do in your classroom. So keep it up, keep sharing the ideas, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.